How many unshed tears have been absorbed by the heavy velvet curtains of the luxurious mansions on Fifth Avenue? We are accustomed to seeing the Gilded Age as an endless celebration of life, where diamonds sparkle, silk rustles, and music plays. But we rarely think about what happened when the candles went out. The majestic facades concealed not only wealth, but also the deep, ringing loneliness of women locked in cages of pure gold. These walls heard whispers louder than screams and kept secrets that could destroy impeccable reputations in an instant. Servants, gliding through the corridors like shadows, saw the true faces of their mistresses, stripped of their social masks and serene smiles. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how invisible witnesses preserved for history the truth about what was really hidden behind the glitter of family jewels and what tragedy could unfold from a single careless glance. Are you ready to learn the truth about who was the only confidant of the most influential women of the century? Mornings in a wealthy home did not begin with coffee and newspapers, but with a painful and lengthy ritual that transformed a living woman into a porcelain figurine. The personal maid, the chambermaid, would come to the mistress's bedroom long before she opened her eyes to prepare the tools for her daily transformation. It was a time when a strange, almost sacred bond was established between the mistress and the maid, one that was inaccessible even to the lawful spouse. Only the maid saw how difficult it was for her mistress to breathe in a corset tightened to the limit, forming a fashionable silhouette. She knew every line on her mistress's body, every bruise from the hard whalebone plates, and every wrinkle that had to be hidden with powder. In the silence of the boudoir, broken only by the clinking of crystal bottles, a silent confession took place, where words were superfluous. The mistress could allow herself to shed a tear only here, where none of her equals could see this weakness. She saw how the fear of not meeting society's expectations constrained her movements and made her gaze dull. But as soon as she finished dressing, the perfect socialite appeared before the mirror, ready to play her role. The maid retreated into the shadows, leaving her mistress alone with her reflection, which was flawless and cold. The corridors through which the maid carried the nightgown retained the scent of lavender and quiet despair that permeated the walls of the house. She knew that in the evening, it would all happen again. The removal of armor, fatigue, and the silence of the huge bedroom. Life in a gilded cage required witnesses, but silent witnesses, capable of taking what they saw with them to the grave. And these women, standing on different sides of the social barrier, were bound by an invisible thread of understanding. Behind every great socialite stood the shadow of her maid, who laced up the corset that restrained not only her body, but also her soul. It was an intimacy that bordered on a complete loss of personal boundaries, but it was necessary for survival in the cruel world of etiquette. Luxury demanded sacrifices, and the first sacrifice was the freedom to breathe freely. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this degree of closeness between people from different worlds? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the ideal marriage of that era? While the reception rooms of mansions were designed to impress guests, the bedrooms of spouses often became monuments to alienation. The architecture of many houses of the Gilded Age originally provided for separate wings for husband and wife, connected only by formal galleries. The maids who changed the bed linen were well aware of the geography of this family coldness, measured not in meters but in years of silence. They saw how perfectly made beds remained untouched in one half of the house, while life flickered only in the other. The nights were the hardest time, when the huge house fell silent and everyone was left alone with their thoughts. In the luxurious interiors, decorated with silk and mahogany, loneliness was felt particularly acutely and painfully. Women often spent hours reading or doing needlework by candlelight, just to avoid going to bed in an empty, cold bed. The maid who came in to extinguish the lights saw this frozen figure and understood that wealth did not guarantee simple human warmth. There were times when the doors between the bedrooms were locked from the inside, and the click of the lock spoke louder than any words. It was an act of quiet rebellion, an attempt to protect one's personal space from a person who had become a stranger. The servants knew which doors were closed and which were open, and this knowledge constituted a map of the emotional state of the house. They saw how, over time, the distance between the couple grew, and they became neighbors living under the same roof. Outwardly, everything looked perfect. Joint outings, smiles at receptions, polite nods. But inside the house, the atmosphere was so stifling that even the flowers in vases, which needed to be replaced daily, were suffocating. The women learned to find solace in small things, in religion, in charity, filling the void with activity. But a glance at the empty half of the bed always betrayed the hidden pain of rejection. This coldness permeated every corner of the house, making it resemble a museum where one could not touch the exhibits or laugh loudly. The servants tried to walk more quietly so as not to disturb the fragile silence that hid the family drama. They became the keepers of the secret that there was no love in the richest bedrooms in the city, and this truth was heavier than any silver trays they had to carry. The story of these bedrooms is a story of how social norms broke living feelings, chaining them in golden chains. It is a story about women who had everything except the right to be loved and desired in their own homes. Do you think that material well-being can compensate for the lack of emotional intimacy in a family? What if I told you that preparing for a ball was not like a celebration, but like preparing to go to the scaffold? For a society lady, a ball was not just entertainment, but hard work, an exam that had to be taken over and over again. Behind the glitter of diamonds and the rustle of dresses lay enormous tension and fear of making a mistake that could cost her reputation. Maids saw how, behind the closed doors of dressing rooms, a tired woman was transformed into the dazzling queen of the evening. This required hours of painstaking work, physical endurance, and incredible self-control. The preparations began long before the reception, with the selection of an outfit that had to be not only beautiful, but also politically correct. The dress had to demonstrate her husband's status, be in line with the latest fashion, but not be provocative. Maids worked tirelessly, steaming meters of delicate fabric, sewing on loose beads, and polishing jewelry. The smell of hot metal from curling irons and the sweet scent of powder hung in the air. The mistress sat in front of the mirror, and her eyes showed not the joy of anticipation, but the concentration of a commander before a decisive battle. Makeup was considered bad form at the time, but women had to resort to tricks to hide the signs of fatigue or age. A slight blush created by secret means, a drop of belladonna in the eyes for shine. These were all little secrets of survival. The maid was an accomplice in this deception, helping to create the illusion of eternal youth and freshness. She saw her mistress's hands tremble as she put on a heavy necklace, the cold stones burning her skin. The weight of the jewelry was the physical embodiment of the burden of responsibility that rested on women's shoulders. At the ball, a woman had no right to be in a bad mood, have a headache, or be tired. She had to shine. A smile became part of the uniform, a frozen mask behind which any feelings could be hidden. The servants waiting for their mistresses in the dressing rooms knew that the return home would be completely different. They saw the mask slip as soon as the door of the carriage or mansion closed. The fear of going unnoticed, not getting invited to dance, or being judged for the wrong outfit haunted ladies of all ages. For young girls, it was a bride market. For married ladies, it was an arena for fighting for influence and status. Every glance, every fan gesture, every bow was calculated and measured. A mistake could lead to social ostracism, which was the worst thing imaginable. The ball was a beautiful showcase that hid the broken destinies and suppressed desires of real people. The servants saw the other side of this celebration: torn hems, lost jewelry, and tears of despair into pillows. It was a world where external splendor was more important than inner happiness. Like this, if you are also struck by the contrast between the glamour of the ball and the inner emptiness. Are you ready for the shocking truth that paper suffered more than any human being? Every boudoir had an elegant desk, often with secret compartments, which was the center of a woman's emotional life. It was here, in the quiet of the study, that lines full of pain, hope, and unspoken love were born. But most of these letters never left the walls of the room, turning to ashes in the fireplace or hidden in secret compartments. Companions and secretaries, who often lived in the house as poor relatives, were unwitting witnesses to these epistolary dramas. Women wrote to express what they could not say aloud, complaints about their husband's coldness, longing for children who had gone to boarding school, or dreams of a different life. Letters became the only way to communicate with themselves and with a world that did not hear them. The ink stains on their fingers were traces of an inner struggle that no one was supposed to notice. Sometimes these were letters to imaginary recipients, ideal friends who did not exist in reality. Particularly tragic were letters addressed to real people, but which could not be sent for fear of scandal. These could be words to a former lover, rejected for the sake of a profitable marriage, or simply to a male friend. Social norms strictly regulated correspondence, and any unnecessary word could be interpreted against a woman. Therefore, the fireplace in the bedroom often became the final recipient of the most sincere confessions. The companion who helped sort through the correspondence saw how her mistress's hands trembled at the sight of a certain envelope, or how she would sit for hours over a blank sheet of paper, unable to begin because the truth was too frightening. These women, deprived of their personal lives, lived the lives of their mistresses through these scraps of phrases and destroyed drafts. The writing desk was an altar of loneliness, where a woman tried to make sense of her own confused inner world. Here were kept diaries in which, year after year, the chronicle of fading hopes and growing disappointment was recorded. These records, if they had survived, could have told us more about the era than any official documents. But the fear of being read forced women to destroy their most intimate thoughts. But even this freedom was illusory, for behind every word stood an internal censor, trained by a strict society. Women wrote and crossed out, sought safe formulations, hid meaning between the lines. It was the art of saying nothing while implying everything, the art of encrypting one's soul. Thus, in elegant mahogany desks, great novels that never began, and cries for help that no one heard died. In the next chapter, you will learn what dark secrets bedside tables hid and why nerves were the most common diagnosis. On the bedside tables of high society ladies stood not only photographs in silver frames, but also many small dark bottles. Medicine at that time was specific, and the main remedy for women's problems was considered to be opium or alcohol-based sedatives. Laudanum, morphine drops, and various tonic tinctures were constant companions in the gilded cage. The diagnosis of nervous exhaustion or hysteria was given to almost every second woman whose soul could not withstand the pressure. Maids, measuring out drops before bedtime, saw their mistresses gradually sink into a fog of drug-induced oblivion. It was the only legal way to escape reality, boredom, their husband's indifference, and endless conventions. A woman would take the medicine and for a few hours find peace that was artificial but salvific. Her eyes would become glassy, her movements smooth, and the pain would dull, receding into the background. Society demanded that women always be reserved, calm, and amiable, suppressing any manifestations of anger or sadness. Emotions, driven inward, destroyed the nervous system, leading to breakdowns, which were immediately suppressed with a new dose of medicine. Doctors readily prescribed these remedies without thinking about the consequences and the addiction that developed very quickly. The weaker sex needed constant support, and this support came in the form of chemical humiliation. First aid kits also contained smelling salts in case of fainting, caused by tight corsets or the stifling atmosphere of balls. But the most dangerous were the nerve drops, which turned living women into obedient dolls. Maids knew when to add a couple of extra drops so that their mistress could get through a difficult evening or unpleasant news. It was a silent epidemic of addiction, hidden behind the velvet curtains of luxurious bedrooms. In the silence of the night, when the effect of the medicine wore off, the nightmares returned with renewed force, forcing them to reach for the coveted bottle. The vicious circle of addiction tightened, leaving no chance for a full life and real emotions. The women existed in a half-sleep, watching their lives as if from the outside, through a cloudy glass. Servants cleared away the empty bottles, hiding the evidence of this quiet tragedy from prying eyes and from their masters themselves. They understood that without these drops, the fragile world of the home could collapse under the weight of unshed tears. The medicine cabinet was not a place of healing, but an arsenal of tools for suppressing personality. Thus, drop by drop, the life force drained away, dissolving into a dark liquid that promised oblivion and peace. And no one dared to call it by its real name, a slow poison that kills the soul. Guess what happened next when the family gathered at the table? The formal dining room was the heart of the home, a place to show off wealth, but for women it often turned into a torture chamber. The long table, covered with a snow-white tablecloth and laden with silver and crystal, separated the spouses like an ocean. The footmen standing along the walls were not just servants, but silent judges of every gesture and word. The silence at dinner could be so thick that the clink of a fork on a plate sounded like a cannon shot. The woman sitting at the head of the table opposite her husband had to keep the conversation going, even if there was nothing to talk about or she didn't feel like talking. She watched her husband's every move, trying to guess his mood by the way he held his glass. One careless word could provoke a flash of cold anger or a cutting remark that hurt more than a knife. The servants saw how the food would not go down the mistress's throat, how she merely shifted it around on her plate to create the appearance of eating. These dinners were a performance for the servants, an attempt to save face when inside everything was screaming with pain and resentment. The children, if they were allowed at the table, sat upright, afraid to move, sensing the tension between their parents. The atmosphere was saturated with the fear of not fitting in, the fear of breaking etiquette, which was more important than human relationships. The luxurious dishes prepared by the French chef were often taken back to the kitchen almost untouched. After dinner, the couple would often go to their rooms without even saying goodnight to each other, leaving the dining room empty. The servants would begin cleaning up, whispering about the latest scene of icy politeness they had witnessed. For them, this table was a battlefield where the remnants of family happiness were destroyed every day. The woman was left alone with her feelings of loneliness, which neither delicacies nor expensive wines could drown out. The dining room was the place where she felt her isolation in her own home most acutely. It was a golden cage where even eating was regulated by strict rules. Every dinner was a reminder that behind the facade of prosperity lay a void that could not be filled with anything material. In the next chapter, you will learn how time became the main enemy and what sacrifices were made on the altar of beauty. In a world where a woman's value was determined by her beauty and youth, aging was a sentence that no one wanted to sign. Gilded mirrors became the cruelest enemies, reflecting every new wrinkle and gray hair. The fight against time was desperate and ruthless, using all available, sometimes dangerous means. Women were willing to do anything to extend their shelf life on the social market. Maids became their main allies in this war, helping to hide the signs of aging from those around them, and even from their husbands. Poisonous lid white was used to even out the complexion, and arsenic drops were used to give the eyes a special shine. Hair was dyed with compounds that could cause burns, but the fear of appearing gray was stronger than the fear of pain. Each procedure was a risk, but the alternative, becoming invisible to society, was even more frightening. The wardrobe also changed. Dresses became more modest, fabrics thicker, colors more subdued. But the soul remained young and thirsted for life, love, and admiration, which were now out of reach. The tragedy lay in the gap between inner self-perception and outer decline, which society did not forgive. Maids saw tears of helplessness in front of the mirror when yet another expensive cream failed to deliver the promised results. They comforted their mistresses, assuring them of their beauty, but both knew that this was a lie to save face. An aging socialite became the object of ridicule or pity, which was even worse. Many women fell into depression, withdrew into themselves, refusing to go out in public so as not to show their fading beauty. They surrounded themselves with memories of their former beauty. Portraits, old dresses, letters from admirers. Their homes turned into tombs where they kept memories of their youth, which was gone forever. This battle for youth was a battle for the right to be noticed, for the right to exist as a person, not as a function. Society wrote women off too early, leaving them only the role of matrons and grandmothers. But their hearts continued to beat and demand warmth, which was becoming increasingly scarce. The story of these women is a story of rejection of the natural course of things, dictated by the cruel standards of the era. They were victims of the cult of youth, which made them hate their reflection and their bodies. Time was the only enemy that could not be bribed with money or connections, and it always won. A husband's wealth did not mean financial freedom for his wife. This was one of the most bitter paradoxes of the Gilded Age. Women wore fortunes in diamonds and furs, but often did not have a cent of cash in their pockets. They lived on credit, on accounts that were paid, or not paid, by their husbands, who had complete control over the family budget. This put them in the humiliating position of beggars, forced to account for every hat or ribbon. Servants and housekeepers knew that behind the luxurious facade often lay debts and unpaid bills from dressmakers and seamstresses. Visits from creditors, who had to be sent away through the back door, were a shameful secret of many noble houses. Women could not dispose of property or make financial decisions on their own. They were merely a beautiful showcase of their husband's wealth, deprived of real economic power. The humiliation of asking for money was a regular ritual that destroyed what little self-respect remained. A husband could refuse to buy something necessary on a whim or for educational purposes, demonstrating his power. Women learned to be cunning, inflating the cost of purchases on their bills in order to get at least a little pocket money from accommodating shopkeepers. It was a life of constant fear of financial ruin or the wrath of a spouse. In the event of her husband's death or divorce, which was extremely rare and scandalous, a woman could be left with nothing. The laws were written by men and for men, protecting capital rather than destinies. Widows often found themselves dependent on the will of their sons or guardians, continuing to live in a gilded cage, but now with a new master. The servants saw their mistress crying over the expense book, trying to make ends meet within the allocated budget. They understood that the sparkle of diamonds does not keep you warm if you cannot buy a train ticket and leave. This economic helplessness was the foundation of the patriarchal system, guaranteeing the obedience of women. Behind every lavish dress was an unpaid bill and a humiliating conversation in her husband's office. The golden cage was locked, the key to which lay in the pocket of her husband's vest. The window in the mansion was the only portal to the big world accessible to a woman locked within four walls. Sitting for hours by the window, hidden by heavy curtains, she watched the life of the street in which she did not participate. She saw people rushing by, merchants, carriages, working women, laundresses, florists, teachers. And paradoxically, she sometimes envied their freedom, their right to go anywhere without accompaniment or permission. The life of a society lady was strictly regulated. Visits, receptions, the opera, church, everything was scheduled and supervised. Spontaneity was an unacceptable luxury. Every action had to conform to etiquette. The window gave the illusion of participation in the bustling flow of life that rushed by without touching her quiet harbor. The maids who cleaned the windows often noticed how wistfully their mistress looked out onto the street. Her gaze revealed a desire to shed her expensive clothes and simply walk along the pavement, breathing in the air of freedom. But her social status was a strict prison from which she could only escape by losing everything. The windows were also a place of secret hopes, waiting for her husband's carriage, the postman with a letter, or just a random passerby. It was a point of connection with the outside world, which at the same time emphasized her isolation. The glass was a transparent wall separating the real world from the artificial one. Heavy curtains designed to protect from drafts and prying eyes often seemed like prison bars. Every evening, the servants drew them, cutting off the mistress from the world and plunging the house into the artificial light of lamps. This ritual was a symbol of the end of a day that had brought nothing new. The window was a silent companion who never interrupted or judged. It knew all the secrets, all the sighs, and all the dreams whispered to its cold surface. For many women, the view from the window was the only journey they could take alone. It was a panorama of life passing by, leaving them in gilded silence. When the celebration of life came to an end, the mansions emptied, and their mistresses were left alone with their memories and faithful servants. Old age in these huge houses was majestic, but endlessly sad. The children had grown up and moved away, the husbands had died, and high society had forgotten its former queens. All that remained were the walls hung with portraits and the corridors echoing with the sounds of past balls. The old lady's last companion was often the very maid who had been with her since her youth. Now they were two old women bound together by a shared life, shared secrets and shared habits. Social distance was finally erased. They could drink tea together, reminiscing about the past. The maid was a living archive, the only person who remembered her mistress young, strong, and beautiful. The house gradually died along with its owner. Rooms were closed, furniture was covered with covers, voices fell silent. It was a time of taking stock when it became clear that the true value was not diamonds, but human warmth. And often it turned out that this warmth was negligible. The history of the Gilded Age is not only a history of capital and construction, it is a history of women's destinies, ground down by the millstones of prestige. We look at old photographs and see frozen faces, but we must remember that behind each photograph there is a living soul who sought happiness. The legacy of these women lives on in the silence that still inhabits the old mansions turned into museums. If you listen closely, you can hear the rustle of silk and a quiet sigh of regret for a life lived in a golden cage. We took a look behind the scenes of a great era and saw that the price of luxury was often measured in loneliness and lack of freedom. The service corridors, these invisible arteries of wealthy homes, preserved the memory of quiet scandals and personal dramas that were hidden from prying eyes. The women of the Gilded Age, bound by corsets and social conventions, were not just decorations in living rooms, but living people with broken hearts. Their stories teach us that no amount of wealth in the world can replace the right to be yourself and be loved. Do you think the position of women living in a golden cage has changed significantly in our time? Or has the scenery changed while the essence remains the same? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover new pages of hidden history with us.